Well, hello, youth group. You may remember earlier this year we started going through the series from Crossway called Unfolding Grace, and it takes the entire Bible, squeezes it down into 40 sections, and even as you look at those 40 sections, you're cramming a whole lot into a very short time. But the one thing I said at the beginning is that we won't skip the hard parts. I was involved in a Zoom conference just a little bit ago, and they asked us to record a video describing one of the passages that we touched upon just a few weeks ago. You may remember that I said something along the lines of this, that we look around at this world, we think of, man, why are things so bad? Why are things so evil? And likely your mind goes back to the second lesson. First lesson, God created everything good. The second lesson is what we call the fall of man. But talking about the trifecta of evil, we've got the fall of man in Genesis 3, but there were two other things that we mentioned in those first few lessons of Crossway's Unfolding Grace. And the second one was Genesis chapters 6 through 9, referring to the flood of Noah. Then after that, we skipped ahead to Genesis chapter 10, 11, the story of Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, what was possibly going on up on the top of Tower of Babel that is just really spooky. But it wasn't a shock to us because we had seen that idea had already been introduced 5 chapters earlier in Genesis chapter 6. So what takes place in Genesis chapter 6? Well, if the only thing you know about is the sweet little stories of the cute little boat that floated on top of the water with the giraffe poking his head out the window and the bird flying around, if you've got that fairy tale image of Noah's flood, if that's all you have is that fairy tale image of Noah's flood, you may be left with the apologetic or the ethical question of like, man, would a good God really destroy the world? If the only thing people were doing were, having bad thoughts in their hearts, and, who among us, if we're honest, would not confess that, yeah, I've had some bad thoughts too? Or was there more going on than that? Well, it's been a few weeks, a couple of months now since we've gone through those first few lessons, but as just a way of reminder, in Genesis chapter 6, you have not the introduction to the spiritual world. That happens in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. But we see where that line, maybe referring to the shirt, where the gate opens up and a world from another world starts merging together. In Genesis chapter 6, you have that story where a gate, if you will, opens up, and one group of beings cast their eyes upon another group of beings, both groups created by God, but crossed a boundary that God said, you do not cross this boundary. And if you will, there will be punishment. What took place that was so evil that God was willing to send a catastrophic flood? Was it just that the thoughts of man were only evil continually? Or did God's creatures, God's beings, did they cross a line that God said only man and woman are to be together? Well, you may remember the conclusion that we came to in that class. A line had been crossed. Genesis chapter 10 and 11, the Tower of Babel, we saw that it doesn't state it specifically in the text, but there are ideas that whatever was going on at the top of the Tower of Babel was another instance of what went on at Mount Hermon, when the sons of God came down and they fell to the same temptation that affects many of us today. The daughters of humanity, created very beautifully, if we can be honest, created very beautifully by the hands of God and in the eyes of human beings. Those sons of God, those creatures of God, those beings of God, they looked upon the daughters of men, and in a pattern that flows from the beginning of the Bible to the end. Here's the Baptist outline. They looked, they lusted, and they fell. Now you say, Tony, that's just too far for me to get into. I can't follow that. Well, without getting into the graphic details of what had to physically happen for that line between these creatures and these creatures to take place, we maybe get in that with the older high schoolers, blurring things a little bit. Is it possible for that line to cross anywhere else? Well, you may be familiar later on in the book of Genesis. We saw this probably maybe about the end of February, beginning of March or so, how that in Genesis, when God shows himself to Abraham, God shows up to Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. And when God shows up in Genesis chapter 18, Abraham cooks a meal for him. So what do we have here? We have a divine being showing up to one of his creatures, a human being, Abraham. And his first instinct is, he's got a body just like me. Let me cook a meal for him. Now, speaking very cryptically now, if divine beings can have a organ system that can take food in, and when they ate the food, they did not turn into a spook and it dropped straight to the ground. No, if they have a body that is in some way like ours, so similar that it can have a digestive system that can digest food. Speaking very maturely to you upper high school students, is it possible that divine beings created by God, who are only a little bit higher than we are, so to speak, as we hear about in the book of Hebrews, is it possible for them to have not a digestive organ system, but a reproductive organ system? So that the gap between the daughters of men and the sons of God is not as wide as this, but it's like this. And when God warned those angels, or when God warned those beings, somewhere along the line, don't cross that line. It wasn't as if God was saying, don't go from here to here. No. What if it was as if God was saying, don't go from here to here, and if you do, there will be judgment? Those of you who followed along with that lesson, I think you'll remember that the conclusion we came to. What does it matter for us? Well, if the entire Bible was written for our admonition so that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope, especially in the face of temptation, we need to guard our eyes, we need to guard our hearts so that we do not fall into the same types of sins that does not just affect high school boys and girls, but it affects the very beings and creatures of God. I hope that you'll think deeply about that topic, and if you will, as I showed you in Genesis 10 and 11 with the Tower of Babel in that section, those sins are going to try to repeat themselves between the spiritual world and the physical world. They even show up later in the book of 1 Corinthians, as we talked about in our adult Sunday school class in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and 11 with the head covering. And we're going to find out when you get to the very end of the book of Bible, there's some little bitty books. Talk about Jude, talk about 2 Peter, talk about Enoch, where it puts in perspective, if we can grasp those first few trifecta of evils, Genesis 3, Genesis 6 through 9, and Genesis 10 and 11, if we can grasp those, it helps make sense of some of those dark passages in the end of the Bible. And what it leaves us with is that when you're in school, or you're in church, or you're on a job, and someone comes to you and says, man, that God of the Old Testament, or that God some places in the New Testament, when he metes out these awful acts of punishment, how could you love a God who does things that evil? We can lovingly, but boldly and truthfully respond, yes, God did mete out judgment upon acts of evil. And while, yes, it did involve the acts of evil humans, but there were also some acts of evil angels going on. And the question is not, is God too harsh toward those acts of sin? What we would find out if we really grasp the lines that were crossed, that God was trying to protect humanity and the human seed that would eventually come into the world so that we can be saved, we would find out that God would be unrighteous not to punish those acts of evil. So think about that over the next few weeks. Let me know if you have any questions. And I invite you to think more deeply with me on the trifectas of evil, there in the first few pages of the Bible, as they set a foundation for the rest of the chapters until we get to the book of Revelation. Take care, and we'll talk to you later.